Hello and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this educational webinar hosted by Foundant Technologies. My name is Mark Larimer. I'm one of Foundant's founders, and I currently oversee our client services and marketing teams here at Foundant Technologies. And today I'm very pleased to be sponsoring a webinar discussing philanthropy's role in dealing with disasters, and more specifically, how community foundations are partnering with corporations, private foundations, donors, and their community's nonprofit and governmental organizations during these times of crisis. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined with Lindsay Laughlin from the Dallas Foundation, Mark Brewer from Central Florida Foundation, and Beth Stipe from the Community Foundation of North Central Washington. They will be your experts today, and we'll be talking you through some of the things that they've experienced on this topic. However, before we begin, there we go. Before we begin, you'll notice that we are using GoToWebinar as the technology platform to run today's event. So I would like to call your attention to a couple of the tools that you will see on the GoToWebinar console. First, you'll notice the Grab tab. This is the orange arrow that appears in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You may click on that orange arrow to either minimize or maximize the GoToWebinar control panel. To better view the full screen, you can minimize that control panel, but when you want to send us a question, you will want to click on that orange arrow again to maximize the control panel. We will be holding a question and answer session at the end of today with the webinar speakers, so please do type in your questions into the white box where you see the words "Enter a question." Simply type in your question, then hit the send button. Please do note we will not be using the raise your hand feature for questions. We just have simply too many people on today. So I will gather up your questions that you've typed in, and then we'll direct them to the different presenters at the end of the session. So as I said, do please submit your questions as they come to you throughout the course of today's webinar. Finally, if you have any technical difficulties with GoToWebinar as a system during the event, please feel free to call GoToWebinar's technical support at 1-800-263-6317, option number 2. Okay, before we jump in, I would like to provide just a quick overview of what you'll be hearing in today's webinar. I'll also provide a quick introduction to Foundant Technologies for those of you who may not be as familiar with us. However, the rest of today's presentation will then largely be the 3 guest speakers sharing their stories, the lessons that they've learned, observations, and some of their advice. As I did say, we will be taking questions from the audience, so please do be sure to type in those questions. When you do so, it does make the webinar that much more successful. A lot of times the question you have is something that's interesting to somebody else. While we anticipate the programming portion of today's webinar taking between about 45 to 50 minutes, that should leave us about 10 minutes or so for questions and answers. All the speakers have said that they're willing to stay on up to about 15 minutes past the hour if there are large demand for questions out there. So we do want to take the time to try and address any questions that you may have or that the webinar may bring to mind for you. So before I kind of move on, though, I do want to take a little bit to talk about why we chose today's topic. We do have a very large audience today, as I said, so obviously this is a topic that generates lots of interest, and unfortunately dealing with tragedy and crisis in one's own community obviously has a very emotional aspect that makes disaster philanthropy, really a kind of different beast entirely. And when no one would choose to have this be a focus area that they wanted to work with. And interestingly, as we were preparing for the webinar with the different speakers, they really discussed how this type of philanthropy almost becomes a kind of a club. It's one that no one really wants to join, but once you're in, you're a lifetime member. And today's webinar will give all of you some things to think about and hopefully to consider planning before your organization may be called to act in a similar type of fashion. Now I want to share just a little bit about Foundant Technology so you understand why we're hosting today's webinar. Foundant Technology is actually headquartered in Bozeman, Montana, and over the last several years we've added remote employees in 9 different states across the United States, so we have people across the country now. We've also been growing very quickly and steadily over the past 11 years, and that can be demonstrated a couple different ways. One is by Foundant being named to the Inc. 5000 list of the fastest growing small companies over the past 4 years. Also, just the growth of our customers. We have over 1,200 grant-making clients using our online grants management solution, which is the solution we're the best known for. It's what we started the company with. But we also have expanded and added some additional products as well. Grant Hub, the map up to the right-hand corner, is our solution for grant seekers to manage their grant proposal process. And we actually launched that product based off of client and also their nonprofit or grant seekers feedback. And a little bit over 3 years ago when we launched it, we now have over 450 nonprofits using the solution. The other solution, and it's kind of the bottom one, is over the past year we've been selling the CommunitySuite product, and that actually came to us through a merger with an organization called Small Dog out of Washington. And CommunitySuite is actually a multi-fund accounting, donor management, crowdfunding solution specifically built for community foundations. And we actually have 67 community foundations using CommunitySuite today, with another about 120 of community foundations using us for our grants and scholarships system. And that number has been growing very, very quickly over the past couple of years, and we anticipate it growing fairly significantly over the next few years as well. So with almost 200 community foundations as clients, we really do feel like that we have a role to play in helping connect community foundations of all sizes and helping them learn and share with each other. And that's really the primary purpose of today's webinar. Many people think that we're only for small to medium sized organizations, and in fact, we actually work with a variety of different organization types and sizes, and our footprint within the philanthropic community continues to grow as we work with both larger and smaller organizations every single day and learning from each and every one of them as time goes on. And Foundant itself is actually up to over 83 team members, and we're very proud of being named to the Outside Magazine Top 100 Companies to Work For the past 4 years in a row. It's something that's very hard to do. And one thing that's interesting is much of our employee growth over this past year or so has really been by bringing in the expertise of the community foundation sector. And just a few examples of some of the people that we've hired over the past 6 to 8 months would be Brian Geary, who is formerly with MicroEdge and the Greater Kansas City Area Community Foundation, Crystal McMillan, who's actually a CPA, also formerly with the Greater Kansas City Community Foundation, but she worked pretty much within the Greater Horizons kind of back office system. Ashley Harper, formerly the Director of Grants for the Greater Memphis Community Foundation, and Elise Broughton, who spent the last 3 years as the Scholarship Manager for the Kern Community Foundation in Bakersfield, California. So it's really one thing that we want to make sure that we're making the point of is that we're committed in not only providing quality software for our clients, but also the expertise for the community to continue to work on and help meet your goals. And that's really is kind of the purpose of doing these types of webinars. So enough about it. With that, I'm going to introduce Lindsay. And Lindsay Laughlin's with the Dallas Foundation, and Lindsay's will be sharing kind of their experiences, more recent experiences from the Hurricane Harvey this past summer. And when you're ready, Lindsay, go ahead and turn your mic on and go from there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark. So as Mark said, I'm Lindsay Laughlin. I'm the Grants Officer with the Dallas Foundation. And as I'm sure you all remember, back in August of 2017, a Category 4 hurricane hit the Gulf Coast. Kind of after the fact, we learned some stats. 13 million people estimated were affected in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and beyond. Also, an estimated $125 billion in damage was done. Something that was unique about Hurricane Harvey and absolutely devastating is this hurricane, once it hit the Gulf Coast of Texas, right around the Houston area, it sat still for days. And we were hearing news reports that the Houston area was getting up to 26 inches of rain daily. As you can imagine, that is completely devastating. So since we are fellow Texans, just 250 miles north of the Houston area here in Dallas, we knew as the Dallas Foundation that we had an opportunity to respond to this tragedy, to do anything we could to help. So what I'd like to talk about today is the two very different ways that we responded here at the Dallas Foundation, and kind of some lessons learned. It's interesting to look in hindsight. Of course, both ways, they were very different, but they were both very needed. So the first way that we responded is kind of our typical response when facing a tragedy or some kind of local devastation. we simply opened up a new fund here, and we made it available for our donors, whether they're donor-advised fund holders or really anyone in our community, to contribute, to make them give that opportunity so they could contribute some dollars towards this effort. So as you can imagine, gifts came in like crazy, even just in those first few days of the storm. I think our smallest gift we received was $10, and the largest gift we received from an individual was $30,000, which is incredible. So over the course of about 5 months following the storm, we raised almost $500,000 for this Hurricane Harvey fund. So meanwhile, while all of these individual donations are coming in, a few of our staff members on the grants team were, of course, researching where are these dollars going to go out in the community after it's all said and done. We knew that many large nonprofits like Catholic Charities, Samaritan's Purse, Salvation Army, they were all on the ground assisting with those immediate needs at the time. So we knew that this fund that we were raising was going to be more for long-term needs, big cleanup projects after the storm. So like I said, about 5 or 6 months after the storm, so just here recently, we so far have partnered with 2 big projects. We partnered with the Laura Bush Foundation, and we were able to completely restore the library of 2 different elementary schools in Houston. They lost all of their collections, all of their books, of course, when the schools were destroyed. And so that's something that we were able to do with those funds for 2 elementary schools in Houston. And then something else we were able to do, when we were researching the Houston area and the other communities in the Gulf Coast, our attention was kind of turned to Beaumont, directly east of Houston up the Gulf Coast, and there were plenty of residents that were still in dire need of help. So we partnered with the United Way of Orange County there, and were able to help provide home repairs for residents there. So, excuse me. That's just one way that we responded. That's kind of the first thing that we thought of is, what can we do here in Dallas to help our friends in Houston? So opening that fund, raising those dollars, and knowing it was going to be kind of a long-term after the storm, a couple of big, meaningful grants to organizations. But what was interesting and what we learned is that there was going to be a second way that we could respond as well. So that first way was definitely our idea and what we wanted to do, and while it was very worthwhile, we also had the opportunity when some corporations came to us. So on September 1st, just 6 days into the storm, we were approached by Jackson Walker. And Jackson Walker is a Texas law firm with offices all over the state, and they have a large population of employees in Houston. So Jackson Walker came to us and just kind of pitched this idea. They wanted to donate corporate dollars to a fund here, encourage other employees that they had across the state that were not affected by the storm to also be able to donate as well, and then advertise this as an opportunity for all of their employees that were affected by the storm. They could apply in. It was a competitive process, but submit an application, tell us exactly what's going on, and then a committee would be able to review those applications and award grant dollars out, actually directly wired into the individual's bank accounts. And we thought this was just such a brilliant plan. Jackson Walker became the first of, I think, about 8 companies that partnered with us that we were able to work with. They all had those similar stories. So it was really interesting. We got those 8 funds opened. Donations started coming in, whether through the businesses, the corporate dollars themselves, or donations from employees of those companies who wanted to help. We kind of ran our plan by legal just to make sure that our legal counsel had helped us cross our T's and dot our I's and make sure that we're all within those specific IRS rules for disaster relief funds. And then we built unique applications through Foundant for each of the corporations. so that when a Jackson Walker employee wanted to apply for assistance, they would log into the site, see the Jackson Walker logo, know they were in the right place, fill out just a really short application for assistance. And then we did our best to just streamline this as best we could, because we knew that these people's lives have been forever changed, and we wanted to make this as easy as possible on them. So once the applications came in, I think that most everybody who got funding, who got assistance, it happened as quickly as 1 to 2 business days, which is incredible. The applications came in. We followed a simple 2-step process. So every application first went to their company's HR director to confirm the employment of that person. And then it went directly to a committee made up of volunteers. Some were employees of these companies. Some were the Dallas Foundation staff or key community leaders here that wanted to help in some way. And we were reviewing applications daily because we knew that so many of these needs were immediate. Once grant dollars were allocated, we were able to make those wire transfers into their bank accounts, like I said, usually same day or next day, which hopefully helps lift a lot of the burdens of how to pay for a hotel for a couple nights, or how to pay your deductible on your auto insurance because you lost your car, whatever the case may be. So it was really interesting to see, we definitely took 2 very different approaches. One was just opening a fund, encouraging people to donate, and then long-term down the road, we were able to help with a couple big projects, which is wonderful. And then the second was partnering with the corporations, the corporate world here in Dallas and across Texas, and kind of broadening the reach of who we're reaching, who's donating, and it gave us the opportunity to provide that direct assistance to those employees. And it was really interesting. We learned a lot. Of course, like Mark mentioned earlier, this is not the kind of thing that anybody wants to have to do, but it's very important, meaningful work, and we learn as we go. Is there anything else, Mark?
Oh, thank you very much, Lindsay. With that, let me get Mark ready to roll, and we'll move on to Mark Brewer. So I'm very pleased to introduce Mark Brewer. He's the president and CEO of the Central Florida Foundation, and Mark's going to be sharing their work surrounding the Pulse nightclub shooting, which unfortunately is a very timely subject for today. And with that, Mark, if you're ready to go, I will turn over controls for you, and you'll be able to work. You'll be able to work the slides yourself. So,
terrific.
Go ahead and take it from here.
All right. We'll see if technology is our friend today, and we can make this work the way it's supposed to. Well, first of all, hello, everybody. The whole focus around disaster grant making becomes more and more important. And listening to the last presenter gives me shivers. As a foundation in the middle of Central Florida in Orlando, we deal with hurricane and storm-related disasters all the time. It's kind of a common thing in Florida, as you might imagine. And every year, after years of doing this, you get pretty good at it. And after a while, you can figure out better and better planning strategies for making sure that you do it well. But a crime scene is a different kind of disaster. And while I'd like to say I hope it's one none of you will ever have to go through, since we started planning this particular presentation, there's been another one in Parkland, Florida last week. So the reality is we live in a world where things are going to happen, and the first step is to figure out what you do about them. So for community foundations, clearly there's a standard set of things everyone's used to doing, but in a crime-related situation, it's a much different kind of process and a different way to think about getting things done. In the beginning, this is a crisis, and it's a crisis at a level that you might never have seen before. Here's an example of that crisis.
boom, I could hear the gunshot. You were hearing all the gunshots. Yeah, I was hearing gunshots right inside the bay here. I'm on text messages just released one from Orlando's fire marshal. United attack. Otis was here. Goes to the picture with the club's owner and blocked the exit. But it's turning for the club's owner right. That is untrue. The fire department now says has no indication that exits were blocked. Finally, it's 5:02, 3 hours after the first call, the SWAT reaches the club. Minutes later, the dispatcher writes, "Bad guy down." Well, very nice. I think our officer did a tremendous job based on the information at the time. Today, the memorial outside the Pulse nightclub is growing. Shocking. Still has worn off. For today, it's here at NBC Orlando.
Now, this kind of disaster creates an incredible crisis and a huge amount of chaos that happens immediately. Because this happened late at night, the next morning as Orlando woke up to learn about this, many people didn't know about it until later in the morning. And so just like any other disaster, the community really begins to turn out. It begins to think about what can we do and how should we do it. But here's where a crime scene's different. A crime scene is locked by the FBI, and depending on the size of the crime scene, in this case, 49 people killed and many, many, many people injured, it wasn't clear for a number of days after this issue whether or not there were going to be more deaths or more problems. So in a typical kind of weather disaster, everybody's got a job and most people know what it is. Here, no one knew their job. They weren't sure what they should do next or how they should get started. And so the first lesson learned for us was that every community needs a strategy, not a plan. Creating a plan sets you up for failure because it assumes that everything's going to happen in a way that you can actually design planned strategy around it. A strategy, on the other hand, is you being prepared to be involved with your city or county jurisdictional folks before an event like this happens so that everybody in the community knows who is the go-to for what. As you might imagine, after a tornado or a hurricane, it's not unusual for a community foundation to start a fund. In this case, there were more than 700 GoFundMe funds established in the first couple of days after this event. The city of Orlando approached us and asked us to help them create the One Orlando Fund, which we were happy to do. We created criteria and set the fund up for people around the country to begin giving. Now, one point to keep in mind here, and something that you'll find is quite it's not very pleasurable to realize that not only is there chaos in these situations, but that nobody has control or can take control. And the philanthropic market is huge and it's international. So if something like this happens in your community, there suddenly is a lot of money flowing at you from around the country from people who have an expectation that somebody has a place for it to go. The fund that the Central Florida Foundation established with the city of Orlando was the One Orlando Fund, and it was created right away to assist survivors and their families and the rest of the community's needs. Within just a couple of days, it became apparent that the community didn't want that to be the only mechanism for helping folks, and the mayor of Orlando came under quite a lot of intense scrutiny from around the country from people who wanted to make certain there was some kind of compensation fund for the victims of the families. Clearly, the Central Florida Foundation isn't in the compensation business, and that wasn't our expertise. So at that point, we turned the One Orlando Fund back to the city of Orlando, who hired a man named Kenneth Feinberg, who is the best-known lawyer in this space in America. He's the guy who managed the 9/11 Fund and many others around the country. And he took it then and created the compensation component. We then opened a second fund on the platform next to the One Orlando Fund called Better Together. And that fund's process was to identify ways that we could work in the community to begin to do some systems work and other kinds of work. We had to gather some real research to understand what we were going to have to accomplish. Little things that you would never think of, like the fact that when lots of volunteer mental health providers show up to help people after a criminal situation, that's a good thing, you think, on the surface. But then when you realize that those mental health providers, many of which were private sector providers who weren't culturally competent about the cultures and communities that were involved in this tragic event, and at the same time didn't have the level of training necessary for a shooting event. It's one thing to understand trauma in the case of car crashes and other disasters, it's something else to know what happens in a shooting incident and how PTSD plays in after that effect. So it took us a couple of days to bring together champions from around the community and to collect those champions in a way that we could have public, private, and independent sector leaders, all of us around the table, who could remove impediments. Because in the first few days, our job was to stay out of the way of lots of things that you might be persuaded to get involved in. And that's a lesson that I hope you never have to learn. Philanthropy rarely belongs in the response phase of a disaster, and that's what this first phase is. In response, you have lots of other money. If it's a weather disaster, you have FEMA, as you may know. In this case, you have the Department of Justice, your state's Attorney General, and lots of other people who bring money to the table and can pay for things immediately. If philanthropy rushes out in front of that money, you'll end up spending a lot of money too soon for things that didn't need to be supported by philanthropy. It's in the next phase, which is the recovery phase, after the chaos stops and the TV cameras shut off and go away. That's the point in which philanthropy starts to play a real role in coming up to bring a disaster to its close, especially if it's a criminal disaster like this, and then it's about healing the community. So once we got our strategy in place and brought everybody together over a few days, we began the process of opening the doors for the rest of the world to participate in the process. The Better Together Fund was open and, in fact, is still available on the Foundation's website, as it still has contributions today. And, in fact, it will probably continue to make grants over the next 5 to 7 years. The reason for that is many of the issues that are at the systemic level have to keep being funded, or they have money that comes from philanthropy to then be leveraged for private sector money or other kinds of money. For instance, in almost any kind of criminal issue where you've got a multiple shooting or you've got some kind of bombing disaster, typically within a couple of months, your city or county will be able to apply to the Department of Justice for a grant that will pay by reimbursing everybody who had anything to do with helping in that process. So that means if nonprofits in the region aren't keeping track of their expenses, the city, of course, and the county will keep track of their overtime, and they'll keep track of money spent for emergency services and for shelter and for other things. But nonprofits need to be doing the same thing, and in many cases, they don't know that. So a community foundation's role may become at this point not only leverage in terms of bringing some capital, but also the ability to make certain that everybody knows how capital flows and to line it up so it comes out of the right pocket at the right time. This particular website included everyone who gave to the fund, every grant that went out of the fund, and the evidence-based return on investment for the grants that were made from the fund. As the process went on, the people that we touched ended up being kind of unique. We created a backbone around the region in really working with lots of other funders. So you might not think about this, but typical philanthropy is really a retail exercise. In other words, something happens, a lot of people show up and want to help. And as you know, if you've ever been through a weather disaster, they always bring the wrong things. They always bring water and clothing and blankets, which is they did in this event and wasn't something that anybody in this disaster needed. And so the concept of being able to bring a funders collaborative together, which we were able to do across the region, from private funders, corporate funders, public funders, and other foundations, so that we could actually create a structure of capital and then identify the things that were most important. In our case, that first thing was mental health care delivery, the ability to provide a strategy where more than 350 people who had been interviewed by the FBI and had been certified as first or second round victims of this disaster. The reality here is you either were in the club when this happened, you were injured in the club when this happened, or you were killed in the club when this happened, and there's a different level applied to you by the FBI in each case. Once we have all that data, then we have the ability to use that as a referral point to make certain that people get access to mental health care and to other things that they need. As you might imagine, there were people in this disaster who had no clue that this was going to happen, and quite at the human level, things happened to them that they could never have anticipated. One man here from Miami who was in the club, whose friend was killed, was lucky enough to escape, but his car was parked in the parking lot. And because his wallet and the key to his hotel was in his car, you couldn't go to that parking lot until the FBI released it, and that was 5 days later. So here was a man stuck in Orlando with no money and no access to his hotel or his car. These are things that typical social service structures aren't equipped to actually deal with. The private sector and the business community were a big part of this, and a collaborative of all the philanthropy in the region came together not to put money in one place, but to begin to coordinate money so that it was focused on measurable returns, outcomes that were necessary. As you can imagine, healthcare providers and systems played a big role here. The hospitals, both of them, including the trauma center that treated most of the folks from this disaster, it was just a couple of blocks from the nightclub. That trauma center and the other Florida hospital then ended up donating all of the hospital fees for the people who were hospitalized during this time. This helped us prepare for other emergency funds that would be drained rather quickly. You may know that your United Way and your housing folks in your community have a certain amount of dollars every month that they use to help people get housed. They help them get into apartments or homes, or they help them meet utility needs. Those funds were ransacked after this happened because suddenly you had almost 1,000 people who were in immediate need for funds typically are used rather quickly in the community anyway. And so the concept was that we wanted to create a system space where we could invest on the front end and have it leveraged. We were able to provide mental health care for a number of folks who then got reimbursed. Their providers got reimbursed by the Department of Justice, extending that mental health care, and then later a SAMHSA grant from the federal government reimbursed again, and some of them got a third level of support moving forward. I tell you all that because the one thing that you won't think about until this happens, and the thing that will be most damaging to you, is that with no data, you'll be running around with your hair on fire trying to help people, in which case you may have no idea what they actually need. So data tends to tie people and progress together, and the ability for us to create data was an important part of the grant making from the fund. In fact, in this community, the systems piece of this brought selected folks together to identify ways that we could create things that would move on. The grant criteria for the fund was an initiative-based grant-making criteria. It wasn't a competitive base. In other words, in a retail environment that's suddenly in chaos, what you really don't want is thousands of nonprofits applying to you for money for things that they can't articulate what they're doing, or which may have no impact on the crisis or the event you're trying to deal with. So the ability for us to identify, which we can because we use a very sophisticated database that is public to this community called Nonprofit Search, which is available on our website. It has 87 data points for every nonprofit in the region. We could identify quickly who was working in the area, who had the capability, who had excess capacity, who had the availability of existing funding that could help bring some process to what we were doing. And then we also had the ability to leverage by identifying where else we could place dollars to make that work more strongly. The healing piece, which is actually the next phase in weather disasters, after we get to recovery, we call the next phase rebuilding. But in a crime scene environment, the next phase is really how do we get strong? How do we recover, get strong, and then help the rest of the community heal? And in this particular community, because the victims of this crime were Latino and LGBTQ folks, their representatives on the nonprofit sector were about 30 or so very fragile and very small nonprofits that didn't have a lot of capacity. They did very good work in the mission areas they worked in, but they had very little communication outside of their mission area. They didn't know a lot of funders, and a lot of funders didn't know them. And so I would put it this way, from a social justice standpoint, these were organizations that had, if you assume the 35 had 12 to 17 board members each, these are all private sector folks in this community that if they were brought together would be a mainstream set of leaders in the community, except many of them had never talked to each other. And so you had a situation where the LGBTQ community and the Latino LGBTQ community not only didn't have a seat at the table, they didn't actually have a voice in things that were going on. So one of our early grants was to establish the One Orlando Alliance, which in essence brought together all of these organizations, many of which had never worked together before, so that they could convene and be a part of understanding how they were going to heal the whole community and not just their specific mission piece. I'm happy to say that as of today, this has now grown into a full-fledged operation with its own executive director. And for the first time, we have data now about the LGBTQ community that we never had before. We got a lot of assistance with this nationally from LGBTQ funders and from other foundations that have a focus on building not only capacity, but the advocacy of these organizations. And they're the ones now that are making certain that ongoing mental health issues and other problems are identified and coordinated through the organizations that have the best chance to help.
Together, our community united to show that love always. Introducing the 49 Fund, a unique scholarship program to mold the LGBT leaders of tomorrow in memory of those that we love.
Now, as a result of the work that we did as a community and the Better Together Fund, a number of other funds have been established, including this one called the 49 Fund, which has now generated scholarships to dozens of people in the LGBTQ community who aspire to become leaders in the community. All of them were impacted somehow by this event, and their great work at whatever level of schooling they're in and their aspiration to be leaders in that community and general communities in the future were the components used to select them for these scholarships. And what this has done is created a forward view for all communities. And this is now taking us to a point where the journey for us continues. I'll just let you know that our colleagues around the country helped us. We stood on all of their shoulders. And in Oklahoma City, where that bombing happened more than 20 years ago, people are still presenting every week with PTSD for the first time. So we anticipate that mental health issues in this community will go on for a generation, and the concept of how you continue to build strength and the healing of all of the community around an event that you never want to see happen again is the ultimate goal of philanthropy after one of these events. We're now officially, we believe, in the third stage of healing and rebuilding, and this is a process that has no end in sight. It will go on for quite a long time.
Thank you, Mark. That was definitely a different view of philanthropy when it comes to disasters, and some of the man-made things are out there as well. So appreciate that very much. With that, I'm going to bring on Beth Stipe, and Beth will be our final speaker today. Beth is Executive Director of our Community Foundation of North Central Washington, and Beth will be sharing kind of the experiences that their community foundation had in dealing with the devastating wildfires over the course of 2 summers. It wasn't just one, and kind of the lasting opportunities and challenges that it has brought. So with that, Beth, take it away when you're ready.
Thanks, Mark. So, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining this call today. I have learned a ton from the 2 colleagues before us, so there's always more to learn. And I want to give you a little bit of background about the Community Foundation of North Central Washington and who we are and what we do. We're a small regional community foundation. We serve 3 counties in rural Washington state, and we have, at the time of the fires, an FTE of about 4.5 people. And so when the fires came, the first round of fires in 2014, in July, we had a phone call first thing in the morning where the town of Pateros had lost over 350 homes. And I think one of the things that it doesn't sound as big as Hurricane Harvey, but for us, when we're talking about these very rural populations, there's a huge spread between where services are available for these folks and also the number of folks who have insurance. In some cases, they can't even get insurance for their homes and their businesses because of where they live. And that seemed to be very typical of where these fires burned. So between 2014 and 2015, we saw over 500,000 acres burned in North Central Washington, in a region that's about the size of Maine, so about 10,000 square miles. And in addition to that, we had another fire that was right outside of our main urban center, which is a town of about 30,000 people, and that's Wenatchee. And in that particular fire, the Sleepy Hollow fire that happened in June of 2015, we lost about 33 homes. The difference between the Sleepy Hollow fires and the Okanagan and Carlton Complex fires, which were those large-scale, broad-based landscape fires, is that those 33 homes were probably in the nicest neighborhood in all of Wenatchee. And so we had people who had insurance, we had highly functioning folks who had access to resources and abilities to deal with these tragedies, whereas in the landscape fires, we had folks who were some of our most vulnerable. And so we had two very different scenarios that we were dealing with. Some of the lessons that we learned early on was that for us, there was chaos in response. So when we think about disasters, natural disasters in particular, you always think about the Red Cross. Well, the Red Cross is going to come in and they're going to save the day, and everything happens with the Red Cross, and they do. They come in and they do a great job. But there are also all kinds of other organizations and people that come in, and as Mark said earlier, they want to bring water and they want to bring clothing, and that got to be a real problem for our areas because these fires weren't over in a day. They burned for weeks. People weren't able to get back into their properties. FEMA never did declare a personal disaster, so there was no support for those folks. And some of the things that we learned about some of these big disaster recovery organizations is that the way that they work, because they are big machines, is that they aren't very nimble. They can't provide, based on their policies, the needs of someone today without having boxes checked. As an example, we had a group that wanted to give some folks who were in shelters the ability to go to Walmart to get underwear because they left literally with the clothes on their backs and that's it. Well, they didn't have their wallets. They couldn't prove that they had lost a home because the fires were still burning and no one could go in and assess whether or not they actually were a victim. And so having some of those experiences, we were better able to prepare for the 2015 fires, knowing that what was happening on the ground needed some additional backup and support. And so there were some partnerships that were built there. So one of the big things I think that for all of us in philanthropy to know, and as Mark so eloquently stated, that there are two roles that we can play. One, immediate response, and two, long-term recovery, because they are different. And oftentimes we see the Red Cross, they're at all of your football games, they're at all your baseball games, they have the text to give number on every major network on the television. They're out there raising funds to support these immediate disaster needs. And then when the disasters are mopping up and on their way, so in many cases are the Red Cross. And so the communities are left with this long-term recovery phase, which is so important to the long-term health of the communities in which these disasters happen. So the Community Foundation did something very similar to the Dallas Foundation. We just set up a fund that anyone could give to. And I think for us, we had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. And I had a bit of experience working in a smaller scale disaster, a flood in Fort Collins, Colorado. And so I knew that this long-term recovery thing just didn't happen overnight, and that we would have a long-term role to play. Because, as Mark stated earlier, they had an idea and they had a system set up, or they have a process set up now of knowing what organizations were out there doing what roles in the community and who had capacity and who didn't for the different things that were needed in support of recovering from their disaster. Well, we didn't have any of that in place. And as I mentioned earlier, when you're talking in very rural communities, setting up long-term processes to help folks recover from a disaster, there aren't a lot of places that are the go-to places. And so we kind of had to pull that network, if you will, together and actually create some of that. And the Community Foundation was really the only organization that, one, had the capacity to take on donations from across the globe, and there were donations from as far away as Europe, and two, to help to bring together all of the different players to put together a long-term recovery process. And so that's kind of where we started. We set up the fund the day that the fires happened. And if it wouldn't have been for Foundant, we probably would not be able to have this call today, because I would have jumped off a bridge, because we had a staff, like I said, of 4.5 people. The phones were ringing off the hook from people who wanted to know where they could bring their cases of water and their truckloads of clothes. And then we had, in a 7-day period, over 500 donations that had to be processed through. We had board members that came in to help answer phones. We had board members that we were able to train using the CommunitySuite system to process gifts, so that those of us who were on staff could make phone calls to build some of these networks that we could put together for the long-term recovery plan. The next thing that I would recommend that any of you do is get out the IRS guidelines, and you have that that publication on this call, because there are rules around what you can and can't do regarding how to support people recovering from disaster. And so some of the just the basic gist of it is that immediately following a disaster, when people are in need of food, shelter, they're stranded, that kind of thing, you can support them without any sort of a needs assessment. That's open to anyone. After that, you have to do a needs assessment piece. And the Community Foundation had absolutely no capacity or capability. That is not what we do. And so we had to come up with a plan as to how are we going to assess the needs of those folks who have been affected by this fire. So the Community Foundation worked with the United Methodist Committee on Relief, UMCOR, and put together a disaster case management program. We were able to take advantage of a community action council in Okanagan County that was willing to step up for the short term to immediately put some disaster case managers in place. And again, UMCOR and those relationships with your faith community, your VOAD groups and your state organizations, those all had to come to the table. And we were kind of one of the main coordinators of all of those relationships. So once we had our disaster case managers in place, it was a much cleaner process. We had those folks who were able to meet one-on-one with folks who had losses during the fires, find out what their needs were, figure out how to help them rebuilding their lives. We had some really wonderful partners at a local law firm, Jeffers, Danielson, Fawn, and Aylward, who stepped up and helped folks get their essential documents, because so many folks lost their birth certificates, social security cards, driver's licenses, passports, deeds, all of those things that are in your home. And these fires were so fast and so hot that there were very few things that survived, even if they were in fireproof safes. So we had that partnership that was put together, and those disaster case managers had access to those folks. They also had access to over I can't even tell you the number of people who volunteered in church groups and Boy Scouts and all sorts of organizations. And so having someone who was able to coordinate those volunteers and give them something meaningful to do so that they felt valued and that their time was well spent was another piece of it. And then we had to put together an unmet needs roundtable. And what that is a group of funders, essentially. That can be the faith community, it can be community foundations, it can be other nonprofit organizations, it can be governmental entities, folks who have resources to provide. And so we put that roundtable together, started meeting weekly, and so that's where the disaster case managers would glean their opportunities to engage these folks with existing resources or opportunities. So as an example, if someone was low income and they needed housing, there could be a federal program or a state program that they could get connected with in the interim while they're trying to rebuild their lives, where long term there could be charitable dollars that can help them move on to the next phase. So they would do that round first. And then if there was no resource available for a particular need for a particular client, then they would come to the Unmet Needs Roundtable. It was an anonymous process, and so we never knew who was asking or what the person was, but it was always this need for this person at this time, and they were all vetted by the disaster case managers. So we bought things like dentures, hearing aids, things that couldn't be replaced. We had a microscope for a student who had lost it in the fire and needed it to continue on with their education. It ran the gamut, and it was all the weird stuff that couldn't be replaced that people needed in order to process forward. Lessons learned, I think that the idea of pre-planning or having a strategy is so important. Knowing who's going to do what, when, and making sure that your community is covered is so important. I think there's so much less of falling all over each other and time wasted if you can sit down with the people in your community that you think might have a role to play in case a disaster strikes. And again, that's your business community, your faith community, your nonprofit community, and your governmental entities, and to know where to point people. And I can tell you that, some of our local nonprofit organizations would have loved to have said to donors, oh, please send your money to the Community Foundation, or please send your money to Community Action Council, because it became a real pain for them to have to deal with that on top of their already existing work that they were doing. And I would say for a lot of community foundations, for us, we fell into this. It's not a role that we would have, if we would have been thoughtful about it, that we would have played, because it really tested our capacity. We are 4 years almost since the first fire. We still meet weekly. And so it is something that you don't take on lightly, because you are part of the long-term process. And I think that if you talk to our friends in New Orleans, they would tell you a decade later that they're still actively involved in helping to recover from Katrina. So knowing those things up front and planning for them is really something that I would encourage to each one of you. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Beth. Appreciate your story as well. And now we'll move into the questions and answers section of today's webinar. So if you have some questions that you haven't already posted in there, please do think about posting those. Otherwise, I'll pull up the questions that have been submitted so far, and we'll start working our way through them. So let's see. I know there's a few that have kind of already come up for Lindsay. So Lindsay and Mark, let's make sure that you're both off of mute and that you're able to respond to questions as they come on. And let's see, let me pull up the first question. 1 second. Okay, so the first one is a question for the Dallas Foundation. It says, with the disaster relief funds for company employees, what was the financial hardship? What was the financial hardship eligibility requirement? Lindsay?
Yes, so I think Beth touched on this a minute ago, and she's actually attached a handout, the IRS kind of rules and regulations around disaster relief funds. A very important document to make sure that we're familiar with these things, and luckily our legal counsel helped steer us in the right direction. But in this case, as she mentioned earlier, immediately following a disaster, so immediately following a flood, as families may be in need of food, clothing, shelter, it's regardless of their financial resources. It's just that immediate need in the moment. So to answer that question, no, financial need is not taken into consideration. Now, I believe for more long-term support, families that are displaced longer than 90 days, financial need may come into it at that point, but that's not something that we had done. Most everything that we had done was specifically for that just real immediate need.
Okay, and let's see, I'm guessing this might come from more the finance or accounting side, but next question to you, Lindsay, was how did the Dallas Foundation price its services to the corporations for the crisis funds as far as what you did for service fees and things like that? If you're willing to share.
Yes, of course. We just priced it. We have a sliding scale on our fees, and we just priced it at the minimum. We certainly wanted to be a good community partner and do everything we could to help with this. But it was a lot of work, definitely. So we just priced it at our very minimum fee.
Okay. Let's see. Next question for you, Lindsay, is what criteria did you use for determining who was eligible for home repairs? Was there a dollar range for those repairs?
A dollar range. Okay, that's a great question. We as staff tried to do our best to ease a little bit of the burden on the committees because, as you can imagine, these committees came together very quickly and they had to review applications very quickly, daily. And so as staff, we met with our legal counsel, we met together and kind of pooled some ideas. And basically what we did in those first immediate needs, so regardless of financial resources for each individual, we looked at kind of three separate categories. An immediate need emergency, category 1. Category 2 was kind of mid-level needs, and category 3 was the highest level needs. And I'll kind of break that down a little bit more. We encouraged each committee member on each committee to look at each application kind of through the lens of which category might this fall in. Category 1, our lowest category, would be, maybe a family had a little bit of damage, would be displaced from their home for a couple nights, needed to come up with that money for a hotel maybe. And then category 2, the mid-level needs, maybe their residence was more significantly damaged. They might be displaced from their home for a handful of weeks, maybe even a couple of months. I think we said no more than 90 days. So some minor damage. And then category 3 was for the most damage. I mean, total losses in homes, lost cars, that kind of thing. And encouraging the committees to kind of categorize the need. That way they knew that when applicant number 2 and applicant number 24 came in with a similar need, they would get a similar or perhaps exact grant size. Just trying to keep it fair. It's very hard to keep those things all level, I guess. And so it really depended on, as far as dollar amounts go, it really depended on the company and how much funding was coming in and how many employees they expected to have these needs. If they had 100 employees affected and only had $25,000 in the fund, obviously we would be a little more careful just to make sure that some funding could go around, but it was first come, first serve. And then we had some companies that raised a lot more money than that and maybe didn't have as many people affected, so we were able to be a little bit more generous. I realize that's not a great black and white answer, but that's kind of how we approached it.
Thank you. Question for all three of you, and this is one I'm sure that probably would be useful for everybody who's on the phone right now. It says, our Community Foundation is looking at putting together a strategy for responding to disasters before they happen. What is the best place to start for planning, and what are the essential steps that we should be considering? So I guess we'll go backwards. Beth, do you want to start, and then we'll go to Mark and then to Lindsay?
Sure. I would say, yay you! Good job. I would sit down with your nonprofit constituents, your grantees in your community, find out who's doing what, kind of a little bit of an assessment, kind of a little bit about what Mark talked about, doing the who has the ability to do what in case of a disaster, and who has capacity. So raising your hand if you have capacity, if you could take something on. And then also make sure that you work with emergency management to kind of understand in your community the different ways that a disaster might occur and the responses how that would be met with. And then I think that that's a great way to kind of give you a framework to kind of start plugging people into where there may be gaps.
I agree with everything. I agree with everything that Beth just said. I would add to that and start at the other end. I think the Community Foundation would have great strength convening the mayors and the city or county managers, whoever plays that role, because the emergency management system is run by the public sector, not the nonprofit sector. And the first step is to figure out how prepared are they and at what places can the nonprofit sector plug into this process. And then if you can get that kind of assessment of what's it look like we might have, what could be the gap, then you can not only bring your folks together by convening, but you can also bring investors and donors together to talk about how you might offset a problem that would happen if any kind of disaster struck your environment.
Anything to add?
I really don't. I think Beth and Mark both hit the nail on the head. I think having the best plan you can ahead of time is very smart, but there will always be things that come up. In our case, that we didn't think about maybe beforehand. I think the key that they both mentioned, and I would just reiterate and emphasize, is all the collaboration, all the partnership. We as community foundations have an awesome opportunity to act as that convener, and I think that's so important in getting communities out of these situations and on towards the next journey.
Okay, all right. Still lots more questions, so we're going to jump back in. But I did just because we are at that hour, and some people may have commitments. I wanted to put up our contact information. Everybody on the phone today has offered their information here freely, and so if you do have questions that you want to reach out directly to somebody, you're able to do so. Otherwise, there's quite a few more questions here that I will go ahead and jump into. I just want to make sure that we got to this slide as well. Mark, there's additional detail saying for the funds coming from the city / county matching funds, are those distributed to the organizations that spent those funds or to the city and county itself?
No, those are federal funds that come through the city and county, and they go to the nonprofits that actually provided the services. It's reimbursement. So the thing to think about, the role a community foundation has here that's really strategic, but you have to be able to think that way, is how could you leverage funding? How could you fund things that after you funded it, they would be continued because the organization you funded would be reimbursed by these grants?
Okay. Let's see, this is a question that could be for either or any one of you. Says, how do you handle confidential records post-process? I'm going to guess, again, I'm going to go backwards on that one. Have Beth, you go first because you're probably the furthest into this. I'm sure you do end up with a lot of confidential information through these processes.
Sort of. So we worked really hard to make sure that we didn't. Other than the donor contribution files, once we set up the disaster case management system, when those individual applications came to the unmet needs roundtable where we were evaluating making financial contributions to individuals, there were no names. There was no information that would signal who this person was. And in addition, we all signed confidentiality forms in case, because in small communities in particular, you may have an individual who is known by some of the people who are sitting at the unmet needs roundtable just because they're their friends and neighbors. And so that was kind of our how we layered on those bits of confidentiality.
In our case in Orlando, we handled it from the top down rather than the bottom up. As you can imagine, you've got victims of a crime sometimes are confidential or need to be confidential, And our victims were all from the LGBTQ community, some of which were not outed, and their families and friends didn't know about their lifestyle and who they were. And so from that standpoint, what we did was set really specific criteria for a center that was open to assess everyone who came to the center for the needs they might have. We then funded the center at a higher level with strong criteria. So the reality is we don't know, I know all the people who got helped as A, B, C, D, E. I don't know them as humans. I don't know who they were or where they came from, but the folks who assessed it and the mental health professionals provided that assessment, and then they determined who would get funding out of the pools of funding that we created for everything from rent and mortgage to utilities to food to car payments, whatever else they needed in that short space of time.
Okay, and for us, with Hurricane Harvey, I think the only thing I would add here in our experience was when the applicants submitted an application for their specific corporation disaster relief fund, the HR director at that company would only see their name and job title to confirm that yes, they are an employee or no, they are not. And then all the personal details about what was going on and what their need was, that was seen only by us and by the review committee. So we did keep that knowledge at a minimum to the to the business. In some cases, we did have a couple businesses where a few employees who were not affected served on the committee, and in that case, we did it completely anonymously. So they were looking at applicant number 1, applicant number 2, and not names of employees.
Let's see, Lindsay, there's a follow-up question for you saying, in Dallas, how much money, again, you can choose to share this or not, how much money was donated by corporations that you mentioned? So what was the dollars that came from there?
Ooh, in total, I would have to double check, honestly. We had 8 different corporations that we partnered with, and some of them opened a fund. The corporation might give us $25,000, and then other employees donate here and there as well. We had some corporations that gave much more than that. And in fact, after the hurricane aftermath has slowed down a little bit, I would say about half these funds have talked with us about continuing on and keeping just a general employee disaster relief fund, not specifically for the hurricane, but for future needs. So in a sense, I feel like some of these money will constantly kind of be coming in and going out.
Okay. Beth, there's a question for you. It says, has your community foundation created materials for responding to the fires that would help others in a similar role? I'm currently working with the community foundation on the Northern California fires.
Yes. So we have disaster case management intake forms. We have confidentiality forms. We have some general process forms, and we are more than happy to share anything that we have. Just email me, and I'm happy to get it off to you.
That would be your answer. Mark, another question for you. It says, with regards to the Florida crime situation, we had a shooting in our mall where 2 died. There were a few injuries, not a large number of people impacted. How large does the group need to be in order for you to provide funding to that community?
I think that's a good question, and I think you have to think in terms of its impact on the total community. A smaller number of victims will have support systems in place. The community foundation role could be to support the environment, the geographic community around it who might have issues resulting from that. It might be that the mall is not a place a lot of people want to go now, and there could be other issues around that geographic community. And so that would be one way to look at it. Typically, you would want to see in a mass shooting, typically that's anything over 5 people, and that usually creates enough issues in a community to really turn the course of how people react and how they think. And PTSD affects people who weren't even anywhere close to the event. So that's more of an assessment question. Does the community need some kind of ongoing support and healing after a mall shooting? That's a question that could certainly be the case.
Next question was, and I think I'll use this as an opportunity just to point something else. So, how is the Hurricane Harvey Corporate Fund able to give grants directly to individuals? Was there anything extra that they had to do to meet the charitable requirement? was there any additional notices such as a check with the accountant when you provided the award, etc. So just to highlight, that was kind enough to upload the IRS stipulations around the disaster component. And if you go to the GoToMeeting console and you open that up, there'll be a spot that says resources. You can click on that and download the resources as well. We'll also forward it after the webinar as well, so you can have a copy of that or have access to it as well. But I think that's number one, your first one. But as far as, for Lindsay or for any of you, is there anything that you needed to do as far as when you were providing any additional details that you provided the people who you provided support to, as far as accounting help or anything like that?
In Dallas, we really didn't. I mean, just before we got on this call, I reviewed this handout again that Beth sent, and I think that it answers a lot of these questions pretty clearly. The IRS has some interesting rules and some regulations on how to do this and how to do it well. So, I mean, we really didn't do anything outside of that, I think.
Okay. A follow-up question on the fees. Says, was there any backlash from the community on taking fees on the disaster funds in order to facilitate the foundation work? Says, it is a huge endeavor and the support fee is more than justified, but I can imagine the public doesn't always see it that way. All three of you, do any of you have feedback on that? I think Lindsay,
we didn't take any. Oh, sorry.
No, you're fine, Beth. I'll just say real quickly, like I said earlier, for our corporate funds, we took our minimum fee, which is quite small compared to our regular fees for other funds we have here. And then, of course, we don't take a fee on the just general Hurricane Harvey fund we opened that was open to have anybody donate to.
We fee our disaster funds at our standard rate, which is typically 2% of the fair market value and 2% of each distribution. And the one thing I would say to you about this, if you live in a world in which people are angry at you because you charge fees for a fund, then they clearly don't understand that grant making is not just writing checks to people who are doing work that no one can monitor or be accountable for. The reality of having to build systems and put money into them and then continue to follow them and figure out how to leverage other funding for them and bring it back, that costs money. And so from that standpoint, if not you, who else would do this? And from that standpoint, I think we argue about this in the field a lot, and I think it's a stupid argument. The reality is that without all the pieces of the puzzle working appropriately, nothing gets done. So I congratulate you. If you didn't charge a fee, I congratulate you on that, as long as you can support yourself in doing it. But that is the work we do, and we're not bashful about charging fees for it.
Well, and I would say that my CFO would agree wholeheartedly with Mark, and I and the board decided that the contribution back to our community was that we wouldn't charge a fee for this, as well as we put in about $150,000 of our unrestricted money to get the disaster case management up and running. And so, we all have a role to play in our communities recovering. And for us, that was the gift that we could give.
Great. All right. Two last questions. One for you, Beth, specifically says, you mentioned that you're still meeting about the fire response 4 years later. Broadly, what are you still working on for the victims of the fire this much later? How do you go about supporting the fire victims in the long term?
So the disaster case management, in my opinion, is critical and key, because it's that one-on-one trusted person that a victim of a disaster can meet with and build a relationship with. And so that's been super important to us to keep that going. And I can tell you it's the craziest thing. As I think it was Mark said, that they're still seeing people coming in with PTSD around the shooting. We still have people who are coming in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years after the fires and saying, I thought I could do it. I thought I could do it on my own, but I need help. And, recovering from a disaster, whether it's a shooting or a natural disaster, people have their own time frame to do that. And so the fact that we are still here and there are systems still in place that those folks can access help, if whatever that help looks like, maybe it's just they need help with getting their assessed value of their property lowered so that they can afford the taxes. It could be a combination of things, but building those systems in place where those folks have a place to go, I think, is a role that we can make sure as a community foundation that's here in perpetuity that we can help keep those lines of communication open.
I think that it may have been one of the quotes of the webinar, that people have their own timelines. So it's definitely something to remember. So last question, this will be for all three of you, and it's a great wrap-up question. It says, should a community foundation maintain a disaster relief fund just in case of a future need? So have you guys set anything like that up, or what's your thoughts? Beth, I'll go with you first.
I think it's a great idea, especially if you've done the homework around planning for a disaster. If you know that you're going to need X amount of dollars to put together a disaster case management team or to backfill the needs that the Red Cross can't fulfill. But I don't know that I would have one just for the sake of having one. I think you got to be a little bit more thoughtful about it than that. And I would say that one of the things that's come out of this is each of our communities have started a long-term recovery organization, which is doing long-term disaster planning, lessons learned on what went wrong with this disaster. We have fires all the time. We've had no snow this year. We're probably going to have fires next summer. But we're going to be well more situated to be able to deal with those fires when they do come because of the experience that we had. And we have one of our long-term recovery organizations that's doing a huge I don't know, it's like a race or something, kind of like a Susan G. Komen thing, where they'll have people run and bike and row the river. And all of the money that they're raising, they're putting into a disaster fund for communities in Washington State to access to start their long-term recovery organizations and case management in case of disaster.
I think not, only because each disaster is really specialized. Now, at the end of a disaster here, which again is pretty much every year, a hurricane's going to hit, but will it be a water-based hurricane? You may not know this. My two colleagues know this on the phone, but most of the damage from a hurricane isn't from the hurricane, it's from the tornadoes the hurricane causes. And so each time the disaster is a bit different. What we do is that if for some reason at the end of a season of weather disasters, we don't spend all the money in the fund, we just hold on to it, and next year, whatever fund we open, we start with that amount of money that's in it, so we carry it forward, but we don't keep the same fund year after year.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, I would definitely agree with what Mark just said in terms of every disaster being completely different. But I do think that it's invaluable knowledge that we gain when we go through one of these things. So maybe that's what here in Dallas we're going to take forward, is everything that we learned this time around, so that we'll be a little better prepared if something should come up next time.
All right, well, we made it through our questions, and so thank you. This is my time to wrap things up. I would like to thank all three of our speakers today, Lindsay, Mark, and Beth. Thank you for your time and your thoughtfulness. Thanks for sharing your experiences. I'd also like to thank everyone who took the time out of their day to attend today's webinar, to think about this and to help plan for the things that, areas where your communities may need to be called into action. On behalf of Foundant Technologies, on behalf of Lindsay, Mark, Beth, and myself, thank you all for joining us. I hope you all have a wonderful day. As you log out of the webinar, you will be directed to take a very quick survey. Please do take a moment, just a couple of questions to let us know how we did. Also to give you an opportunity to provide feedback on how we may be able to improve these in the future. This is something that we do intend to continue to do, is more educational webinars for the sector. So if there are ways we can improve them, make them better, we're all ears. So with that, thank you very much for everyone who attended today, and I hope that you all have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.